I was recently having a heart-to-heart conversation with a friend of mine. We were talking about typical goal setting and methods and measurements of success. We are both familiar with the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle, and were thinking of practical applications for it. Seeking to drastically increase delayed gratification and drastically reduce instant gratification. There are many ways through which this can be done. Fitness. For example, do the hard work more often than not, especially when you don't feel like it. Nutrition. For example, 8 out of 10 meals should be clean. 2 out of 10 can be cheat or treat meals. If you stuff up and fall off the wagon, that's okay. Discipline starts with the next meal. So just make sure the next meal is a good one and more congruent with your goals. Intellect, for example, reading and personal development, as well as creativity, spirituality, relationships, and even leisure and entertainment. Whilst infotainment is not great, it is at least better than mindless trash. And it's really only infotainment if you don't apply it. If you apply what you absorb, it will become more valuable. Granted that what you absorb has real value. This can obviously be applied to business or personal finances as well, primarily boiling down to better management of life's most valuable commodity, time. In line with the principle that 80% of the time you do what you need to do or honestly know you should do for your future self, whilst 20% of the time you do what you want to do in the moment, but honestly know you should not do for your future self. The most practical way of describing this concept to start to improve one's life is probably the much documented idea of a dopamine detox. There are so many dopamine detox videos and forum posts precisely because so many people are searching for the same thing and have for a long time. Yes, I realize the irony that this video adds to that endless stream of information, but the point is it's not necessarily a modern phenomenon. Think of it as urges. For centuries, even in the pre-scientific era, when people didn't understand or acknowledge brain chemistry and were instead concerned with what they deemed demonic possession or otherworldly forces, they were aiming at the same thing, the reduction of instant gratification, the reduction of slavery to base urges. Ultimately, in a religious sense, it's just the reduction of present-day sin for the production of future virtue. Think about it. Dopamine is associated with instant gratification and instant pleasure, as are many sins. So whether you use the strictly rationalist, scientific, or atheistic term of dopamine, or the metaphysical and religious term of sin, you are talking about the same thing to a large degree. Not exactly though, as dopamine is natural and necessary in measured amounts, and it is produced without conscious thought. But an abundance of dopamine can be bad. Constant focus on the apparent importance of happiness is the same thing. The feeling of happiness is a direct byproduct of dopamine. Hence, if you only ever do things that make you happy, you will eventually be unhappy because the novelty will wear off as you search for more and more extravagant, adventurous, and possibly destructive ways to make yourself happy and chase the high. By the same token, you're never going to live a life free from sin. The pleasure one can attain from sin is fun. Sin is attractive and alluring, but an abundance of sin would be destructive. At least start by attempting to sin less than you did before, and slowly work toward cultivating a future of greater security, fulfillment, and virtue. If you've dabbled in this stuff for any extended period, you've probably gone down the rabbit hole of watching self-improvement content with the deep-seated, well-meaning intention of changing for the future. But then you don't actually apply what you learn or hear about from the content to then actually facilitate that change. You know the class you should attend, that's good. You attend the class, that's also good. But then you don't actually listen in class, and that's obviously bad. Then you figure, if I'm not gaining anything, why attend class at all? And you skip it. Being flippant about religion, spirituality, and faith could be viewed in the same way. You know the church you should attend, that's good. You attend the church, that's also good. But then you don't actually listen in church, and that's obviously bad. Then you figure, if I'm not gaining anything, why attend church at all? And you skip it. If you're making the noble effort to identify what you should do, then learning how to do what you should do, but then not doing it, you are no better than the bad behaved student in school who eventually doesn't turn up, and you are no better than the person who doesn't put time aside for spiritual engagement, and thus eventually loses all concept of spirituality, becomes staunchly atheistic, and hence loses part of one's initial being. And it's rather obvious that, metaphorically speaking, the modern world is now made up of more and more people who skipped class and skipped spiritual engagement, meaning they never gained knowledge of the values that self-education and spirituality actually teach in regards to delaying gratification. It rings true that you don't know what you don't know. So if you waste time and don't educate yourself, develop yourself, or engage with your spiritual side to then apply what you acquire, you basically know nothing. This is where people feel lost or, quote, lack purpose, because they don't know what they don't know, and they've simultaneously never really looked. They've had their curiosity to dig for real gold stunted, because they have a pre-prepared abundance of distracting fool's gold awaiting them with the click of a button or the swipe of a finger. They also know this deep down, but since it's uncomfortable to address, they seek to ignore it and forget it, and they do this by flooding their brain with dopamine, from which they will eventually have to detox from again. It is a constant feedback loop, a cycle of eternal recurrence. But the more one finds oneself, chases legitimate goals, or ultimately lives to a larger purpose, the less they will feel the need for instant gratification or seek instant pleasure, because the pleasure will occur naturally and actually be more intense as one's dopamine levels are restored to a greater sense of equilibrium. When you delay gratification, you secure your future self to have a better life, and you do it gradually. Aiming for 100% perfection won't work, especially if you can't even reach the bare minimum. Aim at the bare minimum and gradually progress beyond it to the next rung on the ladder towards ascension. Gradually improve or do less of the bad things you do with the 20%. It can also be applied in the opposite direction, because you're not going to be where you should be straight away. So if you're starting from the bottom, spend 80% of the time still doing what you already know you're good at, what you already enjoy, and what sustains you for the moment. But also acknowledge that this may not be what you need in the long term to have a better life. Then consciously set aside the other 20% of time for working on weaknesses, i.e. what you dislike and what you avoid, until these things improve and become more enjoyable or become more tolerable. If you want to improve your reading frequency and retention, for example, it is too daunting at the start to think, I need to read an entire book or an entire chapter in a certain amount of time. If your attention is currently being most applied to other areas of your life, start by reading as little as 10 pages a day and slowly increase as you make progress. Ultimately, the goal is to slowly wean yourself off of bad habits and create better ones. It's also likely that what was initially a good habit in replacement of a bad habit will itself possibly become less optimal over time and will have to be reassessed and renewed at regular intervals. But there's really nothing stopping you from doing that.